Okay, we're back. Hello, everyone, and hello again, Miranda.
Hello.
How are you going?
It's very cold in Canberra at the moment.
Yeah, I'm in Sydney, and everyone here is complaining about the cold, but I saw on the weather last night that it's already 0 degrees there. So
Yeah, I'd love to be in Sydney right now.
yeah, I bet. Was it a high of 7 yesterday, something like that?
It might have been, but it didn't feel like it. It was beyond cold and rainy, so not pleasant down here at the moment.
That's so unfortunate. And for any overseas listeners or people who work with Fahrenheit, they'll have no point of reference except that Canberra is super, super cold.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I know a way to warm us up with some. That a terrible segue.
It works. It works.
It works. All right, let's get into it. What do we have on this week?
So this week, to just preface before we get started into the content, I want to let people know that we are trialing a new format. So we've had a variety of feedback, all positive, which is awesome, about the digest, and we beg you for more.
Yes, please.
Though a lot of it has been to do with people not being able to get through the whole amount of content in the time that they would like, even though they are really interested in knowing every single piece. So intuitively, we should be trying to condense things a lot more, and that's what we've done this week. So let us know what you think. We've covered a little bit more content than usual, but just in less per piece. So reason being, there's so much happening in the space. I know I say this every week, but like I am clawing through so much content to try and sift what matters, where I never used to have this problem. There was very few pieces that mattered previously.
It's both a good and a bad problem to have.
Yeah. It is awesome because there's so much high impact. Oh, well, again, awesome for us, maybe not for whoever systems it's occurring to. So much high impact, so many high impact vulnerabilities that are happening, and really great pieces of research. So look out for the new format. Let us know what you think.
Yep, please do. Please, we're all ears. We really appreciate your feedback, whether it's good or bad. As you can see, we're using it. So without further ado, what do we got first?
So first up, we have the CVEs, which are our classes of vulnerabilities. So there was a critical in the AWS MCP server, some criticals in Llama Index, highs related to MCP across a bunch of different servers by different owners, and a few other less known tools like Astrobot and Label Studio ML backend, etc. So take a look at those in case any of them might apply to a stack that you're using in your work. Moving on from CVEs, this is a really heavy week for TTPs and vulnerabilities, very high impact. So we'll start off with one that was discovered by Invariant Labs, and they disclosed critical vulnerability in the GitHub MCP integration that allows prompt injection attacks to exfiltrate contents of private repositories through malicious issues. For people who aren't aware, GitHub issues are the gift that keep on giving. And the reason I say that is a good friend of mine, Paul McCarty, he introduced a while ago as a non-AI cousin to this vulnerability, a thing called repo swatting. And if you're aware of the idea of swatting, it's that you would do false calls to like incriminate people maliciously, and their house would be raided, often at their expense or their danger, and that's the idea of like false swatting. And so Paul was using repo swatting, where he would take people's entire repositories or accounts offline off of GitHub, because, for example, he would find a target, and this is for demonstrative purposes, but this is what an adversary would do, to potentially get someone's entire source code deleted for their app, find a public repo on their GitHub account, start uploading malicious files to the issues section of their public repo, because public users can comment on public repos, then report it and have either the account suspended or the repository taken offline. So then that would impact, for example, if they had private repos as well, if their whole account was taken offline. So anyway, that's a fun thing where you can abuse the CI pipeline to just nuke itself.
is fun. That's definitely a version of fun. Are there any ways to prevent that? How does someone protect themselves against that and something like that?
I believe GitHub have solved the issue because it's on their site. It's to do with the workflow. But anyway, that was just a fun aside for people. The real AI related issue that we're focusing on in the MCP connected agents is that you can perform prompt injection in GitHub issue comments on a public repository, for example, and then an AI agent who is using MCP to interface between GitHub and the source code that you might be writing, you can say, oh, can you please find any problems that people have listed in the issues section? And it will go retrieve the issue, accidentally interpret the prompt injection, and then it will impact the code in which they're working on. An adversary would be able to use this injection to coerce the agent into querying potentially other parts of the repository that should be private at the local layer, and leak its contents via its further interactions to the MCP server. Or if it had ability to execute other commands, then it could run those in its local environment, depending on the permissions that it had.
That's so interesting and very concerning. It actually reminds me of a LinkedIn post that you made this week about how agents make all this so much harder because the standard for audit and logging is usually lower or not as clear. Is that relevant here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is an architectural issue where agents are accessing externally user-controlled inputs somewhere in data and able to interpret it back at the original client with whatever permissions that the client has. So I jokingly said that this sort of thing is very reminiscent of like stored cross-site scripting, where a user controls the input and then it appears in other ways, executing permissions within like the client's version. So because of this like architectural issue where the agent inherently trusts any data that's retrieved across these permission boundaries, although Invariant demonstrated it for GitHub, it could feasibly be used when accessing other sorts of data sources and across other environments, including Claude Desktop and similar interfaces like that.
Interesting. As you say, MCP. we've got quite a few more of MCP related ones, so I don't want to talk too much about how vulnerable / weak MCP is in general. Is there a lot of work to try and remedy an issue like this that you're seeing?
Yeah, so you hit on a good idea about the guardrails. So although they're not the be all end all, they definitely are not when they're only applied to the agent's input and output, but you should be sanitizing any data that it's accessing. It's specifically its outputs so that they can't have downstream impacts, and do a lot of architectural safeguards around not mixing trust between your repositories and having one agent being able to work cross-repository, because for example, in this issue, they were able to use a public repo to query and take exfiltrate data from other repositories within the user's environment that the same agent was connected to.
Okay, interesting. Cool. Shall we move on to the next one?
Absolutely. Next one, MCP. So we have talked about previously tool poisoning attacks, in which the MCP protocol, which has tool descriptions and other components to its schema, the tool descriptions that are again controlled externally by the MCP tool in which you're trying to access, can have prompt injection in the description. And when the agent is interpreting the description, and this work was also done by Invariant Labs, I think it is. They do great stuff. It would interpret the tool description, prompt injection, and have downstream impacts again. So CyberArk last week released an expansion upon this idea, saying that it's not actually just the tool descriptions that are the vulnerable field of the schema. And they tried all the other types of parameters, including names, default values, other sorts of flags, and they found varying success in being able to use those components for prompt injection as well. And the varying success didn't come down to because it didn't work, they were using Cursor, which had client-side mitigations as well. So their thesis is that if they used other clients that aren't as well protected beyond like at the architectural level, then it could be more vulnerable to all of those field injections. So they did that. And then they also did advanced tool poisoning attacks. So the first one was called full schema poisoning, and this is now advanced tool poisoning attacks, where the output of a tool, such as an error message or an inference, can contain a secondary prompt injection, which can then be used for data exfiltration, modifying behavior, etc. So they just built upon the original idea.
Interesting, very interesting. A lot of the MCP related vulnerabilities make me think that like so many of these things should be standard, but they're not, or at least in a cybersecurity system or traditional IT system, they might be more standard, but because it's in AI for some reason, it feels like that best practice is still being written as as it's being developed. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, like access controls and identity verification, for example, for the tooling, is relatively new in InfoSec as well. Like people want functionality and then they want security after that, and that's always the way things go. So there are cases as well where DNS, for example, in the cyberspace, was allowing people to browse to URLs rather than IP addresses, and there were a lot of vulnerabilities there that required the growth of DNSSEC as a field, which is security for DNS, and that's happening here as well, where people have made that ANS system, agent naming system, which is to prevent these types of MCP issues by binding a name and a capability to an MCP agent, an MCP tool, MCP server, so that you can verify and trust the identity of that server, which is important because the root cause of all of these issues in MCP, again, is that architectural flaw where they're treating external tool inputs or external data sources inputs as inherently trustworthy.
I guess a lot of the time I feel like best practice or maturity in InfoSec and cybersecurity is old, but then when you really think about it, it's on the timescales of like years and decades. So all of the best practice that we're integrating into MCP now might be considered really basic standard in 1 to 2 years' time, but we're literally at that place where it's just being defined right now.
It is. Like I keep saying to people that the AI space is learning what the InfoSec space learnt over 10 years, but in like 10 days, because everything is just being thrown at them and it's being implemented at much greater scale than ever before as well. So higher impact attack surfaces as well.
All right, shall we move on to the next one?
Perfect. So the next one is a TTP that Cisco Talos, who are a threat intelligence group run by Cisco, have unveiled a malware campaign that's distributing ransomware via spoofed AI installer downloads, and they're targeting users in tech and marketing and the B2B sectors. So we covered something similar to this previously, where it was an AI video generator tool that was actually a malware downloader, but this one is like AI productivity tools for business people. And they're offering free subscriptions using, Telegram, social media, all the classic routes for marketing, and getting huge click rates. And they're distributing some pretty well-known ransomware called Cyberlock and Lucky Ghost, which encrypts files, although doesn't exfiltrate them, just demands a ransom. Basically just makes your files inaccessible. And then a new one called Numero, which totally disables the Windows GUI and just runs an infinite loop that bugs your machine out. Yeah.
Interesting. Do we have any information about the kinds of productivity tools they're masquerading as?
I think they were for like social media automation and helping with marketing and those sorts of things. So yeah, I didn't look too heavily into what the actual content was though, because I'm pretty sure that half the AI tool links out there are bogus.
That's such a practical yet cynical approach. Only because I can imagine so many people who would see a free subscription to like a social media automation tool. Like me, for example, I'd be so keen on that.
Yeah, I realize that I've written as one of the mitigations, like avoid downloading tools from unofficial websites. But the more I think about it, like what are official AI tools? You know, they're all popping up so quickly that it's hard to know that. So I guess I mean ones with valid user histories and use other people as your test dummies first.
Yeah. No, I feel like that's fair advice if people are already familiar with telltale signs for scams and things. Like if it seems too good to be true, if there's some kind of time sensitive offer, if it asks you for something, I guess they're all things you can apply to these kinds of AI tools as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Damn. And if you need to pay for an automation tool, you probably just got to pay for it.
Yeah, probably. Or you should learn how to do it yourself. Anyway. Kidding.
Maybe that's the best advice of all.
Yeah. So the next one is a piece of work by Reversing Labs, and they discovered a supply chain attack leveraging PyTorch models to distribute malware under the guise of an Alien, which I think is the Alibaba AI Labs SDK. And so they just found a few fake SDKs uploaded to PyPI, and they contained no functional SDK code, just a lot of malware. So I don't think they were up there for long. They were up there for less than 24 hours, but they had around 1,600 downloads during that time.
Wow, is that a lot? That sounds like a lot to me.
Yeah, I feel like under 24 hours, totally. And it just shows that everyone in the AI space is hopping on anything new. Like people will just download it and give it a go immediately.
Mm-hmm. Why were they only up for 24 hours? Were they discovered as malicious that soon?
Yeah, Reversing Labs actually were the people who reported it. And so upon installation, the packages, they would load a weaponized PyTorch model that performed like a pickle exploit, like a deserialization attack. So, which we're familiar with from previous issues where the Hugging Face weren't detecting pickle model vulnerabilities as well.
Sure, interesting. Yeah, we've seen a lot of interesting research from Reversing Labs, specifically in supply chain attacks like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how many TTPs do we have left? We've got 2 more. Okay, so this one's interesting actually. Maybe one of the first AI guided discoveries of a critical CVE. So a security researcher called Sean Healin, he used OpenAI's O3 model with no wrapper, no fine tuning, no, particularly well-crafted system prompt, etc., to identify a remote zero-day vulnerability in the Linux kernel's SMB implementation. So Sean provided the O3 model with annotated SMB code, and he asked it to identify some unsafe memory operations. It flagged a mem copy involving an untrusted client input and unchecked size field, which resulted in a stack buffer overflow. So then he had control over memory adjacent components effectively. And yeah,
listeners who might not be familiar with SMB code, what exactly is that?
So SMB stands for server message block, and it's a communication protocol used for file sharing. Yeah, that's pretty cool because he said he did like nothing special to the model at all and was able to get such a high impact vulnerability out of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm wondering many things. Like, I guess this must have been one piece of code of many that he tried. And I'm sure there must be like more of a methodology that he used, but the fact that he didn't have to change the model at all, super interesting. Is this one of the first? I'm not so familiar with the discovery of many 0 days from off-the-shelf AI tools.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one of the first, or at least like the first confirmed, accepted by NVD as a critical CVE.
Okay, so gets the reward money then if this researcher found it but using GPT?
Well, it's human augmented bug bounty, so
OpenAI's probably got enough money.
Yeah. Like I mean, yeah, if you're asking that question, you're going to open a lot more questions about any sort of human AI interaction and the merit of any of that. That's intense.
Interesting. So what are some of the lessons learned from this?
I suppose that people are worried about how adversaries will adapt AI technology or jailbreak it to reach their ends, though this is demonstrating that publicly accessible tools are perfectly fine at performing that sort of work without any adversarial alteration.
Yeah, it's
so
really the bar. Yeah, like the dual use technology, and I mean a lot of people are investing in offensive AI as well. Could easily be used for offensive or defensive purposes, I guess, depending on where in the attack chain you put it.
Yeah, so the final TTP is a report that OpenAI released very recently on how they have detected and disrupted the malicious use of their tooling. So they have detected several state and criminal affiliated actors leveraging models for deception, coercion, and different kinds of abuse. And they were identifying this through API logs, usage patterns, and user reports, and sort of corroborating like open source intelligence with, was this ChatGPT generated? Let's try and figure that out. And they resultingly suspended accounts, tightened usage, let the international partners for policing and intelligence find out. And so some of the schemes that they covered were deceptive employment schemes, which no one in particular is doing it, but like North Korea's done it a few times, is the unattributed actor who's used OpenAI to write resumes, cover letters, and code to apply for remote developer jobs in Western corporate networks. So that's an interesting one. Some operations linked to Russia used for generating AI content, English language content about the Ukraine conflict, and some linked to China as well, rewriting historical events related to China and distributing that. Some linked to Iran, again, performing disinformation around particularly US and Israeli narratives, and then the rest were about child exploitation, romance scams, that sort of thing, performed by criminal syndicates for financial abuse.
Interesting. Concerning, but it's a good thing that this kind of activity is being found. I can't help wondering, and so for listeners, definitely check out the digest because it describes the different operations and who it's linked to, which is really interesting. And the kinds of names like bad grammar, high five, gotta love that. But I can't help thinking, like, if these activities are linked to all these places, there's Russia, China, Iran, like who are the people in those nations that are doing this? An intelligence service would create its own offline model. Are these like low-level criminals then? Like even a highly funded enterprise wouldn't just be using the GPT, API.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it's not like the state itself performing it, state-affiliated or state-sponsored actors who are with, plausible deniability performing actions for the interest of the state. And so if they're looking for something quick, I'm sure they would use public models, and probably not thinking that it's very attributable what they're doing either.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm sure there'll be a lot more of this work to come out, maybe not in the public domain, but if this is what we're seeing in the public domain, then there's definitely a lot of interesting work going on in this space.
100%. And it's good that these sort of relationships are being built between the AI companies and, law enforcement and intelligence organizations as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess we'll move on to the news section. So Reddit's suing Anthropic as of very recent over data scraping. So Reddit's not against data scraping. They just make sure that they know who's doing it. So they have, what do you call it, like corporate agreements with Google and I think OpenAI as well, which allow them to use Reddit content for training. Although, the purpose of having these agreements is that they allow users to opt in, opt out. But if they have people who are just scraping it willy-nilly off the web, then that sort of user privacy control is not there. So they have an issue with Anthropic having done this since July 2023. And yeah, there's a lawsuit open at the moment.
Interesting. I know that training on copyright material is a really big issue at the moment for lots of companies. I think it's interesting that Reddit does already have a system for other AI companies being able to use their content that is being used by like the kinds of organizations that are getting a bit of flack over this at the moment. I guess I'm actually a bit surprised to know that Anthropic has been doing this. They sort of market themselves as the more ethical competitor to OpenAI, right?
Yeah, they do. I think it also introduces some interesting ideas about monetizing data, which is not a new idea, but previously it was all about selling demographic analytics to marketing companies, right? So that they could provide you more targeted ads on platforms. But now it's all about preventing the use of and then being able to monetize the sale of any sort of data for AI training.
Interesting. I wonder where this is going to take the market for training data, because we know it's already a big market and has been for a long time. But with generative AI being so hungry for like live data, real-time data, that might make it a lot more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's a lot of agreements that need to consider like RAG sorts of models, and yeah, you can use this for training. Can you use it for querying, like on the spot, that sort of thing?
I think not to spend too long on this, but Anthropic is a really big organization, of course, so they'd have a lot of eyes on them. But I suspect that there's a lot of other smaller companies that would just do this as standard, and there might be a bit of a culture of, well, so-and-so company does this, why shouldn't we? And they don't get caught because they might not be quite as high profile as like an OpenAI or an Anthropic.
Yeah, tangentially, a few weeks back, I saw some complaints from smaller businesses about majority of their website traffic coming from AI crawlers, and it was really impacting their infrastructure. So that was interesting. They said just like masses of both like live inference, like RAG searches, as well as scraping for training data formed such a huge amount of traffic that it was impacting latency when they didn't have very strong infrastructure.
Interesting. Someone is going to have to create some sort of policy governance legislation around that at some point.
Robots.txt, but for AI, which we covered last fortnight. Yeah. What else? Yeah. Oh gosh, this piece of news is like this next one. So some Chinese researchers, oh my God, they created an AI model that reconstructs 3D faces from DNA sequences. So this is hectic. It's called Deface, and they map like stable genetic markers, which are things like the like shape of your nose, jaw structure, brow curvature, and other cultural related facial features as well. And it enables the model to infer facial topology with high fidelity, theoretically throughout, that exists throughout someone's lifetime. And so they're able to detect how a missing person might appear is the use case in which they're presenting, which is awesome. If you can use it for humanitarian reasons like that, missing children, and being able to define what they might look like 10 years later when their case is still active, that's awesome. Though I can, that's just not how it's going to be used en masse is my skepticism. Like, I'm just thinking sample a person's DNA at birth or at any point in their lifetime, map their physical development over their lifetime, and have visual surveillance with very high confidence. Although they haven't mentioned its ability to have proof detection when someone's like weight fluctuates and other things like that would impact their structures. So
Interesting. Talk about dual use, because in theory, that, as you say, that's really helpful. Like if you're looking for murder suspects or missing people, or even for like anthropological research, if you're like looking at very old DNA and reconstructing humans or something. But in practice,
evolutionary.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But like in practice, the fact that this technology exists, and if it's not well regulated, then yeah, I think it's ironic that it's called deface. It sounds like deface, which has a negative connotation to it, but it's actually spelt D-I-F, face.
Yeah, I think it uses diffusion models probably, which is why it's the diff.
Yeah, I feel like it's a Freudian sort of slip type word, given how it could be used. But it'll be really interesting to see how this kind of technology does get used. Because if this was developed in the European Union, this would fall under like a critical or high risk form of AI that wouldn't be able to be used. But because it's developed in China, it can be used. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, I think, as I left in the digest a comment about, it's a great time to become a plastic surgeon, because I think when these sorts of technologies are in play, physical augmentation is going to be the new thing, so that you can't, your DNA doesn't map directly to your natural features because you've got none left.
Yeah, there we go. That's the last resort. Just like change physical features.
Yeah. I think face masks are going to come back in heaps as well.
That's true. Yeah, that's really true. That's interesting, because of all the places in the world where face masks are already more common, it's places like China. So I wonder how that would impact that too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, that's all for news. Now we're getting onto the research, and we have 4 pieces to cover. So the first is from Cloud Security Alliance, who are very active in the AI space in creating very innovative solutions that bring the best ideas from InfoSec across into the AI area. So they're positing that you can solve that trust problem that we've been seeing in multi-agent systems through a zero trust framework for identity management. So they, identity access management, so IAM, if people aren't familiar with the acronym. And their paper goes through the discrepancies between traditional protocols that already exist, like OAuth and OIDC, versus what agents actually need for an effective security protocol. And so some of the criticisms that they make is that traditional IAM systems, they break down in the context where agents need to operate briefly or intermittently. They need to modify their capabilities dynamically and interact with other agents across varying trust boundaries, as well as operating at machine speeds. So in their solution, and an example of that I might provide is, say in a a financial situation, an agent might need access to read access to perform data analytics on some trading data. But at that point in time, it doesn't need to be able to modify any trading data. It's not performing any actions. Though once it decides that a trade would be beneficial to make, it should have to get approval to make that trade and edit trade histories, etc., rather than just having it latently hold that much permission from the start. And that's a non-critical application, but you can also think of war applications, warfare, where it shouldn't hold the permission to execute at any point in time. That should be a permission that it needs to be granted based on a set of other outputs and verifications that it can provide. So they propose a solution that has identity components, ZK proofs for private verification between agents of identity. They use the ANS, agent naming service, that we've talked about for binding capabilities to agent names and verifying that an agent remains unchanged and untampered with, and also some session management components to make sure that things are only lasting for certain amounts of time.
Interesting. So I don't know a whole lot about agent identity. So is the reason that traditional identity management is because it sounds like it's a bit more static and it's pre-registered identities, but then agents are dynamic? How do agents get identities at the moment? How does that work?
Well, currently they don't technically have identities, so there is nothing that can verify that, except for, I guess, authentication levels that people are implementing themselves for MPC, MCP. Why do I keep saying like MPC? MCP, for example, that verifies an agent is who it says it is and performs the actions it says. But yeah, the idea with like IAM in general is that you can determine that this agent or this service is genuinely the one that you intend to talk to from a valid owner or company that you trust, and that it hasn't been altered between the time that you've first produced a trustful relationship and in the time in which you continue using it, so that there's been no upstream impacts that will affect your relationship and your interactions with the service or the agent, like someone hasn't hacked it upstream and is causing problems, or you're not facing like a spoofed version that is from someone who's been able to impact the domain that it's coming from, things like that.
Okay, interesting. I can imagine that there must be a whole lot of inherent characteristics about agents that must make that management process like more complicated / harder and require adaptation. I guess that'll be a really interesting area to see evolve.
Yeah, definitely. I think granularity of permissions is one of the biggest like point solvers for AI agents executing permissions that they shouldn't hold at any given time, and having a trust layer like this that is dynamic enough to be able to approve capability grants on request and adapt, so that agents can adapt to different tasks is very useful. And as a benefit, they also mapped it to the Maestro framework, which we'd love to see.
We do love the Maestro framework.
Yeah. Awesome. That one was an absolute piece of work. I did my very best describing it, but I apologize to the CSA people if they're listening and they want to write a post about it. Go for it.
I think it was.
It's like a really, really tech heavy piece, and I am not super across like authentication protocols and InfoSec. Like that's not something I've looked into hugely. So reading it, I was like, oh gosh. It's like, I know this is good and I know that it's needed, but I probably can't offer great criticisms on it.
Like you summarized it in a way where I was like, Miranda is an expert on this.
Half of it's probs wrong, so we'll see. Awesome. So the next piece of research is an agent-based red teaming framework, which is outperforming traditional, I guess, manual jailbreaking techniques, and the use of AI for single-step jailbreaking. So just producing one-off prompts and sort of leaving it at that. So these guys have, guys and girls, they thems. Anyway, Cynthia, just cut that out. These researchers.
It was fun, and then it became way more awkward.
It's okay, we'll just clip it. Yeah, so these researchers have produced a technique called composition of principles, so COP, and it's a framework where an LLM orchestrates jailbreaking attempts based on some user-defined guidelines at the very beginning, and then it just and these guidelines, for example, might be like, oh, you need to obfuscate your intent and be very quiet and make sure that this is as least detectable as possible, so that it sort of strays away from very obvious jailbreaking techniques if that's necessary. And then the agent takes those and plans, composes, and adapts its strategy, completely executes like a jailbreaking sequence through iterative reasoning. So it effectively acts like an intelligent attacker, and it plans attack paths from principles it knows about different jailbreaking techniques and iterates them based on the reply it receives from the LLM that it's attacking, rather than brute forcing, which is the traditional technique at the moment, where you're just generating masses of prompts and firing it in the first turn to see if anything happens. And they had very strong performance against even models with defenses for jailbreaking. And yeah, I guess it's pretty scary to think that set and forget hacking is here.
I was literally just thinking that it's always been something that people have talked about, as in, oh, it's a coming threat, but it's a couple of years off. If it sounds like this paper is at least demonstrating that it's sort of here, what are the limitations on this agent? Like, how scalable was this? Or like, were there any assumptions that the researchers made? Is this actually something that people could start like developing and deploying and hacking stuff now?
Yeah, it totally is. I think it's very feasible, and we're seeing other people adapt this model not just for jailbreaking, but for doing reconnaissance on systems as well through agents, and doing that sort of iterative refinement where, oh, okay, this port is open, but I know that that is not a vulnerable version. I'll check the next port. Oh, this is vulnerable. I'm going to, try and exploit this protocol, and then they producing like fully end-to-end exploitative agentic systems. So I think this is like the limitation of this paper is that it is very narrow. It's only looking at jailbreaking at the prompt level when or red teaming at the LLM prompt level, where there is a whole world of use case for this exact sort of orchestration workflow that moves beyond this into potentially more critical spaces.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. And again, development of the technology is exciting and useful for defensive purposes, but there's some real concerns from an offensive perspective too.
Yeah, and this is, it is literally just effectively functioning how an attacker would be functioning and iteratively refining their prompts, but at machine speeds. So
yeah, great.
Yeah. Like I guess something interesting I can bring up as well is that I read a paper. A question I have when reading this is like, well, what would your defenses look like against a system that is learning your guardrails and your defenses through interaction and being able to make inferences that, oh, okay, this kind of attack didn't work. That means they probably have this sort of thing. So I'm going to adapt to this. And I came across a paper that proposed this thing called ephemeral infrastructure, ephemeral being, very short-lasting infrastructure, where they use Kubernetes clusters to continually just burn and redeploy new infrastructure so that you can deny attackers the time they need to perform reconnaissance or, I guess, pivot their attacks by making sure that they only get a certain amount of time to look at any given agent.
How fundamentally would an agent change with every deployment that the dwell time matters that much?
Well, they would have to find it again, first of all, because they're pointing their infrastructure at existing infrastructure, and if you're burning and redeploying, and there's some sort of trust level where only the previous infrastructure knows where the next piece is going to be, then yeah, it'll be hard for them. They need a human there to try and redirect their agent to the right place as well. So I haven't looked hugely into that paper because it was, again, like a very big piece of work, but it could be an idea.
Yeah, interesting. I guess at the end of the day, if we're looking at AI-driven offense, the only way to, I guess, more effectively, more resiliently defend ourselves against that is AI-driven defense.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. So 2 more pieces for research. So this next piece, interestingly, challenged the idea that LLMs are vulnerable to different kinds of content, and instead they're showing that their context length and even not the content, like not malicious content, will cause misalignment problems and jailbreaking. So they studied a bunch of different variables in many-shot jailbreaking, like having more examples in a shorter set of tokens, having different topic composition where they had hate, violence, totally benign content, and then like mindless content. So things like lorem ipsum, just spammed, or that mindless text, structure type, so free structure, again, the nonsensicalness and varying levels of harmfulness. And they found that vulnerability correlates much more strongly with context length, and that drift occurs much more at context length, allowing for easier jailbreaking than with finding content, which is also more likely to be picked up by guardrail defenses. And they found that, yeah, a lot of model degradation occurred when there was an extended context window, and fine-tuning couldn't prevent that either.
So, okay, that's interesting. So it's saying that it doesn't matter so much what content the language model is absorbing. It matters more how much content it takes in its context window. Why is that?
They didn't have a great, what do you call it, hypothesis on why that was, other than that it becomes more difficult for alignment to stay like front of mind for the model, and that the larger context window allows it to sort of drift and be more susceptible to other things. And it's interesting because, you know, a lot of the jailbreaks that we see, they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to really shift my language and I'm going to break it on the first prompt, and I'm going to really obfuscate the intent of the malicious content that I'm hiding in this jailbreak. And it's more and more so either becoming detected by defenses or less impactful due to alignment of the model. And these guys are just saying, nah, just come through with a bunch of null text, shove it in until you've reached like 30K, and then put your prompt and you'll just break it.
That's so interesting, I guess, because so many people have the tendency to anthropomorphize more models. Did I say that right? Anthropomorphize models. And this doesn't necessarily seem intuitive to me, at least. I'm surprised by this. I think this is quite interesting.
I think that it sort of is. It's like when you wear a human down, they're more likely to say yes to you.
I guess so. But the fact that it's more influential than the content itself. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I guess in some ways that sort of makes sense from a human perspective, but yeah, I don't know. This is very interesting research.
Yeah, it makes it hard to think how you would adapt your prompts to it when it's not necessarily the content that you need to be safeguarding from, it's the content within the context of use. So like, oh, this is a model for writing code. Why are they spamming me with lorem ipsum? That's not a valid instruction. I should reject it, you know, and that's what defenses should look like. But, you know, another sort of architectural idea that links back to a conversation we had a few months ago about in the digest was that maybe single-use AI is inherently more secure than general purpose, because it would make it easier to like isolate that the context for its use, and much easier to apply these guardrails for context rather than on a universal model that has a million use cases for general purpose. Because if you have AI like, you know, general purpose AI like ChatGPT, someone might be spamming at lorem ipsum. I don't know why, but it's probably hard to detect that as like a misuse. Whereas if it was, again, like a coding bot specifically, then it would know something was up.
Yeah, 100%. Because it seems like there's a really easy defense to this, which is just to make the context window much smaller, but then that would dramatically decrease usability in general purpose models, but not so much in other kinds of models. I
mean, they do it in like at the machine level in InfoSec for computers within a network. Like permissions are granted in some critical infrastructure at the machine level, and this machine is responsible for like a single use or single storage. So that could be the go for AI as well.
Interesting. Okay, is this our last report coming up?
This is our last report. It's on from our friends at CSIRO in Australia. CSIRO. So they have introduced a technique to improve deep fake detection systems over time without degrading their past performance. So their approach is called RAIS, rehearsal with auxiliary informed sampling, and it's a continual learning method that helps models learn new data for deepfake detection whilst remembering old data, which tackles a lot of things that we're seeing about, what's the word for it? I can't remember what the word is, but when models are being retrained, catastrophic forgetting. So they're often losing data from their original training and just really heavily weighing on their fine tune or their reinforcement learning data, and that's causing alignment drift or not just alignment, but like goal drift and all that sort of stuff. So here they conducted experiments in 5 languages, and they had a really high success rate using their new technique in detecting deepfakes.
Interesting. Okay. So that's sort of implying why exactly does it matter so much that they are able to reconsider the past training examples that it's forgotten?
Well, that would be like the foundational data that gives the model, I guess, like a grounded knowledge of its task, like the world that it's operating in, help it perform all of its initial like clustering and feature extraction. And if it starts to forget that, then it will only apply much, perform much more strongly on examples that have been added in the training, like the retraining phases, and it then will become less able to make inferences about scenarios that were much more broad from that initial training data set. So catastrophic forgetting, just it's almost like your model is entirely retrained, and its new task is its new clustering is based on the latest pieces of information.
Yeah, interesting. And so it looks like this approach is giving the model extra metadata that it can use to better detect the deepfakes. I feel like I'm always hearing about new deepfake detection methods, and they all seem very cool to me. But is there a way that this is fundamentally different or better or advantageous to other kinds of methods?
I can't honestly say that I've seen a lot of deepfake detection methods at the moment. So that's why I was excited to see this one. But I think the idea of metadata means that it's not so like the retraining process is not so expensive. Like they don't need to pass in all of the like something I have seen more often is how people are trying to tackle this catastrophic forgetting, right? And it's all about, okay, well, we'll sample the new training data and we'll push in some of the old as well and try and make sure that it remembers its original context that way. Whereas this one is using, like you said, label generation to assign auxiliary data to these like reinforcement pieces and pushing that in at the same time so that it is able to remember like the past data as well.
Cool. Okay. Well, I guess, now I think about it, quite a lot of the techniques I've seen focus on video deepfakes, whereas this is audio deepfakes, which does seem...
I don't know many for audio.
Yeah, it does seem like it'd be a bit harder because there must be fewer like signals to be able to detect based on, and tends to be adopted. I mean, this is a generalization, but I would say maybe adopted more frequently, or at least in practice, quite a lot of authentication methods would already use voice detection, but not necessarily like video detection. Okay, interesting. This is really cool.
Yeah. I've got to look into more audio deepfake detection, or I haven't done much with audio models in general, other than playing around with like the newest capabilities on them.
Well, every report in the digest, I always end up with a list of things like, oh man, I should go read into this more, or I should learn more about this. It's great because the AI security space is so big, and I'm very grateful that we have these reports and digests to stay up to date. But it also highlights just how wide a field it is and how much knowledge there is there and how quickly it's changing. So definitely a lot for the viewers, but hopefully everyone's found it useful. I certainly have.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final piece we'll leave people with is a resource. So there's a project going around called the vulnerablemcp project, and its domain is vulnerablemcp.info. And it's a community maintained database that's cataloging all of the security flaws that are arising with MCP. So it highly values community contribution, though if you're just using it to inform yourself, then there are very up-to-date examples of MCP vulnerabilities being hosted there.
That's really, really cool. I love that there is a resource like this for like researchers to contribute to, but also people to learn from. I'm definitely going to have a bit of a look at this later.
Nice.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
All right. Any final thoughts? That's the digest.
That's it. Like I said, there was a lot, and we were able to talk to it in an hour, but you can read it much quicker on the news.
But if you want to hear us, if you're driving, you can hear us talk about AI security. What better way to drive home from work?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Miranda. I'll talk to you again next fortnight.
Yeah, we hear it.